Okay, right now I want to bring up somebody from the former BAI, journalist, analyst, and editor, Don DeBar. Please give a good welcome to Don.
Thank you very much. Thanks. I'm going to make it short and sweet. I'm going to start with what people usually end with, please buy my book. Earlier this year, I was asked by Cynthia McKinney, along with a group of about a dozen other people who had had some experience with or expertise in the situation that occurred in Libya last year, to contribute to a book that she was going to edit. And I did. I wrote two chapters, one of which we ended up using, which had to do with the role of the progressive media in manufacturing acquiescence among the left in the war that was conducted against Libya without an act of Congress, without any real discussion in the public sphere, and without the support, according to polls, of the American people. A 9.5-month bombing campaign was conducted against a country of 6 million people. In one day, when I was in touch with Cynthia McKinney while she was on the ground, she was hanging out with some people from the African Union, and one day in Tripoli, they counted from 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. 80 bombing attacks. And if you think about the fact that two airplanes hitting a building in lower Manhattan, Tripoli has about the same population as Manhattan, about 2 million people. Those two planes reverberate 11 years later throughout our society, legally, culturally, socially, and in many other ways. There were 80 or 40 times that conducted in one day out of a 9.5-month campaign against the country of 6 million people. The war on Libya I'm going to discuss in some depth because it is analogous to the war that's currently being conducted against Syria. For those who aren't aware of it, the war in Syria is not an indigenous uprising against a dictatorship. It is a ground war being conducted by proxy on behalf of the United States, with the support of its NATO ally Turkey on the north, and some of the other adjoining countries, including Iraq and Jordan. The supply lines for the troops come from the west. The weapons come from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Libya, and elsewhere. And the U.S. has been itching for many months to be able to conduct an air campaign in support of that ground warfare, similar to the one that they conducted in Libya. To date, the only thing standing between the United States and that air war has been the veto of Russia and China at the United Nations Security Council. And for that, both of those countries have had to endure quite a bit of vitriolic rhetoric at the UN and elsewhere from Susan Rice, Hillary Clinton, and other U.S. officials. Let's see. I'm going to kind of go through the outline of this book as a guideline to the history of the adventure in Libya. And first, I guess I want to do a little bit of history. Point out that Syria has something in common with both Iraq and Egypt. In the late 50s and early 60s, Nasser's Egypt and Syria became one nation state. It lasted 5, 6, 7 years, and there were hopes that it would become reconstituted after they formally split in the early 60s. At that time, the Ba'ath Party that was in control of Syria also saw the rise of the Ba'ath Party, which ended up coming to power in Iraq later. And in fact, the Iraq flag of that period was essentially the flag of the nation-state called the United Arab Republic, which was Egypt and Syria, with 3 stars on it, anticipating that the 3 nations would become one. The concept for the United Arab Republic came out of the philosophy, the ideology of Pan-Arabism, the hope and the aspiration that there would be political unity among Arabs, both to counter the insertion of essentially a European colony into the area there, known as the nation-state of Israel, and also to deal with the resurgence of colonialism that was represented by the UK and particularly the United States entering into the region post-World War II. Britain had been there before. France had been more or less displaced, and the United States was soaking up the slack and really bringing the oil production and the exploitation of resources online there post-World War II. So Egypt and Syria have had an interesting relationship over the past 40 or 50 years. And in the last 2 weeks, there was an event on that timeline that caught my attention anyway, which was the newly elected president of Egypt taking the side of the United States in the conflict in Syria and making a demand that the government step down and that a transition to the rebels, as they're called, be effected. How many people think that the uprising that's taking place right now in Egypt and elsewhere is the result of a movie or a movie trailer on YouTube? Showing hands. Okay, not many.
Rough crowd.
This is an easy crowd. A rough crowd would all have their hands up. I'll use Libya as an example because it's the one I'm most familiar with. As I mentioned, there was a 9.5-month bombing campaign last year. Probably every family in the country lost someone, suffered a death or a serious injury. The infrastructure in the country was more or less leveled. This was a country that had the highest standard of living in Africa and one of the highest standards of living in the Muslim world. And that is a change from the early 50s when it was documented as the poorest country on the planet, and from the condition that existed in 1969 when Muammar Gaddafi removed the puppet king Idris from power and began what became known as the Libyan Revolution. By the time of early 2009, just about every Libyan had their own home, owed no rent for their home, no mortgage for their home, and no property taxes for their home. Housing was treated as a human right, and it was provided to every Libyan family, and ultimately to every Libyan that came of age and left their family's home. That's one thing. Another was that health care was free and available to everyone in the country, to the extent that if you needed care outside of the country, your transportation and your housing and health care in the United States, UK, Switzerland, wherever, was paid for by the government. Education was free through the postgraduate level, and if you could get accepted to a university abroad, they paid your bills to go there. There is now rubble where that nation state existed. And as I said, most families have suffered some sort of a serious loss in the last year or two. So festering beneath the surface, and probably more important in a country that was essentially secular than a movie insulting the Prophet Muhammad, was this most recent change in the condition of Libyan people. And I'd like to postulate that that is what was driving the unrest in that country. In Egypt, you've had a revolution in process since January of last year. And unlike most of the uprisings in most places around the world, as a matter of fact, in Egypt, the people have stayed vigilant at a number of points where the demands that they raised were first embraced by and then betrayed by the people in power. You had, at the beginning of their revolution, the army siding with the people and not firing on them, and more or less enforcing the removal of power, removal from power of Mubarak and some of his aides. And as the army asserted itself against the people at various points over the last year and a half, they've gone back in the street. We saw that happen after the parliament was dissolved, and we saw that happen again after the army attempted to clip the wings of the newly elected president. Now, in the last 2 weeks, we have first the elected president more or less declaring a rapprochement with Israel, which is not where the center of gravity exists among the Egyptian people, and taking the side of the United States in Syria, which again is not where the center of gravity lies among the Egyptian people. And so I would like to postulate that the unrest in that country is more likely tied to their dissatisfaction with the direction the government's taken over the last couple of weeks than over a 13-minute YouTube trailer in English. So anyway, that's just a little bit of background. In Libya, you saw, as we saw in the 2002-2003 Iraq War, there was first a demonization of the regime. And it was interesting that this was done in Libya because in December of 2010, like 3 months before the UN resolutions 1970 and 1973 were issued, there was a report that was finalized for the United Nations on the human rights conditions in Libya that gave a very, very favorable report. And almost every marker, including the material ones, some of which I just described, the commentary from a number, I would say the majority of different representatives of different nations, members of the United Nations General Assembly, gave positive review of the situation on the ground in Libya. From December until February, apparently there was a change of heart in the Libyan government, and it went from being the sponsor, essentially, of these major changes in the period from 1969 to 2010, turning into a monster that bombed its own people, shot its protesters in the streets. There was an accusation brought to the United Nations that 6,000 people had been murdered in Benghazi and Braga, and the things of this nature were being floated. And the response to this, which was delivered, by the way, in a wall-to-wall manner across the Western media, on the one hand from Fox, all the way out to Democracy Now! Free Speech Radio, that the narrative was the same. Gaddafi's crazy, the Libyan government is tyrannical, they're killing their own people, they're a threat to their own people, and something needs to be done about it. And so, we have at least 2 tracks that were followed that have been documented subsequently. One is the track that was reported. You had activity at the United Nations that resulted in resolutions declaring sanctions and a no-fly zone. And that was in mid-late March, I don't remember the dates. However, on a separate track, which for some reason could not make its way into the media in this country, despite the efforts of a number of people, myself included, to deliver it, was the fact that the United States, UK, and France had landed troops in Benghazi on the 23rd and 24th of February, a month and change before the UN resolutions. That was first reported in the Pakistan Observer, the English language daily in Pakistan, and repeated elsewhere in some foreign media. It was delivered by me personally to Democracy Now! On the 25th and again the 28th of February and again several times over the course of March. And it never was referenced or referred to. And the other was the fact that the Russians had provided satellite surveillance information addressing the claim that was presented to the United Nations that Gaddafi or the Libyan military were strafing and bombing protesters from the air. The Russians, after this was presented to the United Nations, presented first just a statement of fact that we've been watching and that's not true, and then the actual documentation that showed on this date, at this time, these are the pictures. So while the Wheels were turning at the United Nations, and when the resolutions were adopted, it was shortly followed by the announcement by President Obama of a no-fly zone, which immediately became a preemptory bombing campaign, which turned into a 9.5-month bombing campaign, logistical support for the quote-unquote rebels, and as I said earlier, ground troops, which actually predated all of that. You also had a wall-to-wall propaganda war targeting primarily the American people and also the Libyan people. There were a number of independent reporters on the ground at the time. In fact, I'm going to digress for a minute. I was in Tripoli in October of 2009, and Cynthia McKinney had asked me to go with a delegation that she had assembled that included Wayne Madsen, the journalist and former intelligence specialist, Bob Fitrakis, a journalist from Ohio, and you might know him from his involvement with Harvey Wasserman over the Ohio election fraud in 2004. But he's a very active journalist, professor of political science, and I think he ran for governor or something, a Green Party candidate in Ohio also. And Glenn Ford from Black Agenda Report, a half dozen other journalists and academicians and activists. And when I walked around Tripoli for a good 3 days with my video camera, just documenting things and talking to people and such, and the concept of Libya as a police state, to anyone that actually spent any time there, is laughable. There were so few police, as a matter of fact, that it was dangerous to cross the street without looking 5 ways. They really didn't have sufficient police resources to monitor red lights in the city of Tripoli, let alone to monitor the activities of all of their citizens. So anyway, having known the members of the group that I went with, and Cynthia took 2 other groups to Tripoli in the intervening period up to the time the war started, and there were some other journalists. When people went in and stayed there during the war, I knew some of them, and I was in contact with them, and through them I met several other journalists, in particular Mahdi Nazamrawaya from Canada and Lizzie Phelan from the UK, who stayed on until the very end of the fall of Tripoli. And we were in touch over Skype and Facebook, and they were sending me video and other information. And while the United States and Al Jazeera, the Qatari news agency, for those who don't know, Al Jazeera is controlled by the Qatari monarchy, which is essentially a medieval monarchy. And by that I mean, if you were going to compare it to Great Britain, compare it to pre-Magna Carta Great Britain in terms of the power of the monarch in Qatar, similar to the situation in Saudi Arabia. The Qataris were arming the Libyan rebels, quote unquote, and they also were providing the actual troops for the takeover of Tripoli. They had troop transport ships in the harbor in Tripoli in the invasion of Tripoli. But in any event, targeting the Libyan people, the Libyan press was taken down almost every other day by bombing attacks, by terrorist attacks. And so the only source of information people in Libya had about what was going on in their country was from foreign news sources, including Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. And they were, like the media here, reporting wall to wall this incessant march across Libya of the soon-to-be victorious indigenous resistance to the dictator Gaddafi. While that was being reported, and while reports were coming to us of uprisings in Tripoli on July 1st, there was a demonstration, documented, videotaped, where almost the entire population of the city of 2 million, more than 1 million people, filled the Green Square, demonstrating support for their government and for what the structure there was called the Jamahiriya. And that wasn't reported even anywhere else in Libya because the local infrastructure was taken down. What was reported instead were pictures that were shot in Qatar of supposedly Green Square in Tripoli, showing rebels shooting. And I was talking to somebody outside before. One of the most common videos that they'd have would be 6 or 7 guys with 1 or 2 rifles and some smoke in the background. And this, there would be some Arabic text at the bottom of it, and then an explanation that this was the group that had just taken over this town or this part of this city. And something we could grab a half dozen people now and go stage on any dead-end street in the metropolitan area. It'd take 20 minutes to do it. So the war was conducted essentially not just with the bombing and with the troops, but it was an information war, and that was the point that I wanted to make. And that's the parallel to what's going on in Syria today. Most people in the United States don't know very much about Syria. They don't know that it borders Turkey, Jordan, Israel, Iraq, and Lebanon, for example, that it sits right in the middle of all of this stuff that's going on in that region. They may know that it's aligned or that there's an alliance with Iran, because Iran is also public enemy number 1 again this week, as it has been on and off the charts since 1979. Some may or may not know that the only port outside the old Soviet Union for the Russian Navy still exists in the northern, it's in Tartus in Syria, which provides them access to the Mediterranean. And probably very few know the history I recited before of the relationship of Syria to Egypt and Iraq historically over, in the period post-World War II. What they do know, or what they've been told, is that Bashar Assad is a brutal dictator, that he kills his own people, that the killing that's going on in that country right now is the government killing the citizenry, and that the Russians and the Chinese are blocking the United States from intervening for humanitarian reasons to put an end to the bloodshed. The facts are, of course, quite different. The bloodshed is being conducted on behalf of or directly by the United States, France, and Britain. The purpose is to remove Assad. The geopolitical reasons are obvious, to block the Russians from using Tartus as a port in the coming period, and to deprive Iran of an ally as they move towards Tehran. We saw back in the early 2000s that they were on the list. We had the list that our friend was good enough, the former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was good enough to provide us, that listed Libya, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and so on. And all of those have been in play or are threatened to be in play. And right now we have a presidential election going on. We have a war that we're conducting. We have one that we just finished conducting, and no one is talking about this at all. To the extent that we hear anything from Romney about Obama conducting the war illegally, he is upset that it wasn't conducted harshly enough. To the extent that Obama is conducting a war in Syria now illegally, again, the only fault Romney finds with that is that's not being conducted harshly enough. There's some really interesting things about Libya that I think, the one I'm going to mention, and I think I'll leave it at that. October 20th of last year, 2 things happened. One, that was the date that Gaddafi was murdered by the group that calls itself the NTC, but the agents for the United States. When Hillary Clinton said, we came, we saw, he's dead, which is kind of different from what she said last week. The other thing that happened on that date was that a lawsuit that was brought by Dennis Kucinich and 9 other members of Congress seeking to impose constitutional and statutory authority on the president who was conducting an illegal war That lawsuit, which was brought in May, was dismissed on the same day. Now, the suit brought by members of Congress saying the president is illegally conducting a war should go on an express track through the courts so that it's at the Supreme Court almost immediately when you have such heavy material consequences involved. And what happened instead was the government stalled and delayed and made a counter summary motion for dismissal that the court, rather than ruling on so that it could go up and end up being judged on the merits at the U.S. Supreme Court level, they sat on it so that it became moot. And on the day that it became moot, they dismissed the case. I don't think that's a coincidence. The case was 5.5 months old. And to me, it shows, first, the fact that Congress never got involved outside of these 10 members, that there's been a complete abdication of congressional oversight with respect to war making. And I know that's not a shock to most of the people here, but it is a fact that needs to be repeated. And it should be a major role in the congressional campaigns. And I bet you out of, however, 435 House seats and however many Senate seats are up this year, that very few are going to even mention war powers. But that is already a major deterioration from what happened in 2003, because as you'll recall, they went through the motions in October of 2002 before they invaded Iraq. And at this point in time, they don't feel the need to do that anymore. At least this president doesn't. And as I said, we are now involved in a war in Syria. And again, the Congress is not involved, and it's not an issue in the campaign. And outside of making a number of reports that are intended to incite support for quote-unquote humanitarian intervention, you don't hear anything about it in the media either. I think that puts on the agenda a task for us, because if we can live with that condition, we really aren't going to be living that much longer. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Excuse me. What did I don't understand what you mean by it became moot in 5 months.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, the question was, you don't understand why I said it became moot on October 20th, basically. You have in the law the doctrine of mootness. If you bring a lawsuit to stop someone from doing something, and even if you're right, they don't have the right to do it, if you get to the point that it's actually done, they'll dismiss the case because that part of the case is moot. At that point in time, they had, or at least to the extent they claim they had already conquered Libya, and really the mission of that was regime change. They had killed Gaddafi. So that to me was an interesting coincidence. As a matter of fact, just on that point, I don't know how many people are aware of this, but in fact, the government, quote unquote, of Libya does not have control of the country. The government still cannot hold a press conference in Tripoli, except at the airport, with the army surrounding the airport. There are a number of cities in the west that are under the control of the loyalist forces, they call them pro-Gaddafi forces, whatever, the Green Resistance they call themselves, who are in effect the Libyan national resistance. We're not hearing about that, but it's going to be interesting to see the role that plays in the shaping of the country over the next period. So, okay, any other questions?
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you, sir. What particular detachments of the United States Army have been deployed in Libya?
I don't know the answer to that.
You don't know?
No.
Any proofs of these detachments?
I'm just telling you about the news reports, which never made their way into the media here.
From Pakistani news or what?
Pakistan Observer.
What is the source of this news? What is the particular
I guess you could check that with them. I mean, I assume you were asking the question and you were laughing before because you don't believe that it's true. So I'd like to know.
I know it's not.
Well, and what is the source of your information?
I have the sources in the United States Department of State.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That of course is the most credible that there is. Okay. Any other questions?
Does either of you prove it?
Prove.
Yeah, no, prove whatever you say.
It's
Either if you prove it, it's an open point.
Right. Well, all I did was say that the United States that they reported that this happened, and I believe that it did. But that's that's that. Other questions? Yes.
Oh yeah, outside a few enlightened people that go to the internet or have access to say,
Mine is this guy right here, disinfo agent.
Yeah, let him ask his question.
Excuse me.
What?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Outside, outside, almost forgot. Outside a few, people that seek the news from sources on the internet, like Russia Today has some broadcast outlets now, like Dish TV and Comcast. We have what we call the mainstream media, which has been discredited, and most people are very suspect of what they broadcast. But then we have something called the alternative media, which takes the guise of Link TV, Free Speech TV, Pacifica, Democracy Now!
Right.
And most people think maybe they are getting an alternative source of news about the world from these so-called alternative sources. And it's been my observation in observing, especially Democracy Now!, that they are complete shills for NATO aggression in Libya. Amy Goodman doesn't miss the chance to get Hillary Clinton on the microphone when she can and give her a nice long soundbite, or Susan Rice, or even Amy Goodman started a report on Syria with John McCain calling for intervention. How can would a group organized do to educate, have teach-ins or whatever to what used to be called the anti-war movement about this background noise that you have to shut out?
Well, this is perfect because it gives me an opportunity to again say, buy my book, The Illegal War on Libya. How book. My chapter actually is entitled Radio Pacifica's Descent from Voice of the Voiceless to Partner in the Imperial Information War. It's 20 pages. And essentially what I did was document the coverage from Pacifica, Democracy Now!, Free Speech Radio News, Al Jazeera, and I selected two of the morning programs. That was the Wake Up Call here in New York, which I was the former news headlines director for, and what's his name, Ian Masters from KPFK, who also airs over the airwaves here, and compared the reporting that they had with the timeline of facts that has come out since that stuff was being reported, and show the vector from the factual events that were happening in the country and the reporting that was taking place at Pacifica Radio and Democracy Now! And others wherever else they're carried, because both Free Speech Radio News and Democracy Now! Are carried outside of Pacifica as well. The in terms of your question, what can be done to organize against it? I think the most important thing is to not so much focus on what they're doing, but to try to provide alternative information, so to make it available to people and find a way of delivering it so they actually see it, to bring the facts to people as quickly as possible. Because the strongest argument you can make generally is one that's based on facts, and presenting facts to people it tends to sort of be a magnet at some point. When people see over time that what you reported turned out to be true and what they've been listening to turned out to not be true, after a while they come around. We are, in fact, a number of us who are former producers from Pacifica Radio, Bernard White and myself, and a number of others, running an internet radio network called CPR Metro. It's Community Progressive Radio, and it's cprmetro.org on the internet. I do a 3-hour morning show every day, which I'm going to have to leave soon to prepare for. And we have an awful lot of voices from all over the world that provide additional information. So, anyone else?
I just wanted to say that we're a society that sits there and lets information come to us. We've got to learn to go and ask for information from various sources. We cannot sit there and let it flow over us. We've got to ask. We've got to become a democracy which asks questions.
I agree with
and
that.
we sit back like
Consumers. We're used to consuming.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay? Yes?
This is a real question. When Osama bin Laden was killed, when President Obama was in the White House and Osama bin Laden was killed, do you think that was the real Osama bin Laden? Do you think that he died in the building about 10 years earlier?
See, that's the problem. No, when you have an open society, then you have evidence. Everyone sees, this is a rather ghoulish, thing to have as the subject matter of the discussion, but you would have the body available for inspection rather than, ferreting it off at night and dumping it in the ocean, which is what they said happened. So when you have already a media that polls at, 30% of 40% tops as being trusted by the, people who rely on it for their information, and then you manage events in that way, you leave people like us saying, well, I don't know, did he die of kidney failure 10 years ago? Are there 5 Osama bin Ladens? Was there no Osama bin Laden? Is he really a member of the Bush family? And nobody can prove any of it. And I think that's the point of what they do. They have a very elastic narrative because there are no touchstones of facts and evidence. And to the extent any evidence exists, there's no chain of custody for the evidence, so anyone really can reconstruct what happened after the fact. I don't think that's an accident, but it is one of the things we have to struggle with. Yeah, I see somebody's hand, but I can't see.
Yes, hi. I would like to present this question to you and Mr. Tarpley. It seems like the UN is like a phantom agency where, according to the UN Charter, in order for one nation to make an aggressive act against another nation, you would need some type of Security Council resolution approving it, or as an act of self-defense.
Right.
Today in the media, you hear all this talk about Israel preparing to bomb Iran, which would be, according to the UN, against international law. But no one ever seems to talk about that in the media. So, and the same thing with the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. They didn't have any UN approval, Security Council approval. So why aren't there any repercussions towards nations like the United States and nations like Israel? Why aren't they, if the UN is it's a world body, why aren't they sanctioning countries like the United States for actions, and Israel, who plans to bomb Iran? And technically, according to their intel, they say that the nuclear facility at Fordo is so fortified underground that you would need technically a nuclear bomb to basically destroy it. So you're going to use a nuclear weapon to destroy another country suspected of creating. It doesn't make any sense to me. It really does.
I agree. I can't answer your question other than to say it is obviously a function of power. If there were, first of all, the United States has a veto power at the Security Council. So if someone attempted to take an action at the Security Council, which would could lead to some military action or military sanction against the United States, it would be vetoed. That's at the front line. And secondly, of course, is the fact that where exactly are you going to assemble the military wherewithal to punish the United States for one of its actions? That's the second part. The third part, and I think it's really the most important component of the entire thing, is that the American people themselves apparently do not care that their leaders violate law, national, international, whatever. The Bush administration was widely acknowledged by the American population, the American voters, only 3.5 years ago as being the most lawless administration, and to hear most of them talk in the history of mankind, to hear Democrats talk. Yet, when there was a Democratic Congress elected in 2006, taking office in 2007, straight up through the President Obama administration, now there has not been a single action taken to hold a single one of those people responsible for those illegal acts. And in fact, where there's been any action taken, it has been to expand the powers claimed by Bush to legitimize them to the extent that that's possible in the face of the Constitution and international law, and to commit outside of those actions even more offensive acts that are even more violative of international law, like the war on Libya. again, at least the war in Iraq had the sanction of the U.S. Congress. The war in Libya didn't even have that. And the raison for the war in Iraq, as full of nonsense as it was that there were weapons of mass destruction. They didn't even have a cause of war against Libya when they went in and blew the country up. So the problem is that there's no place to hold them accountable. Either here, we're not doing it. That's the real problem. And internationally. And so that's why they do what they do, in my opinion. Yes. You? Yeah.
He just said that the American people just don't care about what the government does over there in the Middle East. I find it embarrassing that the only people doing anything against it are the pacifists, so-called liberal left or liberal peace groups. The major anti-war movement doesn't seem to care. Basically think that they're being bought up by the American government, the ruling class. They're giving money. Right here, we're going to do what we want to do. Shut the bleep up.
You know,
and what are your thoughts on that? It's embarrassing.
There's that book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, that betrays a very interesting dynamic that deals with, the entire, nonprofit world and the role that it may play.
I've been thinking about that a lot because it's really, really embarrassing that the government just do what the hell it wants, and the anti-war movement, so-called, just stays quiet.
And then you also have the overlapping control of certain civil institutions like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. You have Suzanne Nocelle, who came from the U.S. State Department, who was one of Hillary Clinton's top people, who in fact, when she started at the U.S. State Department, this is an interesting contrast to the game she was playing at HRW with respect to, because she was there, now she's at Amnesty, with respect to Libya only a year and a half ago, the games that she was playing trying to discredit Gaddafi. Her contact with Gaddafi took place when Nelson Mandela and Botha were negotiating an end to apartheid. And she was there sitting at Botha's side while Mandela had Gaddafi sitting at his side. So in any event, directly, it's sort of off the time, but directly you have essentially these instruments of civil society that should be pointing out to the American people that these things are happening, that are firmly in the pocket of the U.S. State Department. So, I mean, in almost every area that we've got, the leadership of some of the former anti-war groups that were mobilizing people against the Iraq War, sitting on their hands once you had a Democratic president. You have the two groups I just described, how many others just, sitting on their hands and allowing this to happen. I think, again, if you go back to the revolution will not be funded, there's a dynamic that's unveiled there that I think pertains to this. You had your hand up? Yes.
I wonder if you know of any treaties that Russia has with Iran, secret or otherwise.
Well, obviously, I don't know of any secret ones. There are treaties between the two countries, including, I believe, a non-aggression pact and a mutual defense pact. But I'm not. If you asked me to respond in a couple hours, I could research it. I don't know off the top of my head.
There's a pipeline.
Yes, there it comes. You then you.
Speaking of nonprofits, do you have any information about Doctors Without Borders participating in any pro-war or imperialist actions?
Not that I know of, but that doesn't mean. Yeah.
Kushner.
Okay. Hang on a second. Yes.
It's called Differentiated Containment, the U.S. Policy toward Iran and Iraq, for CFR, July 1st, 1997, that outlines their whole entire
How to do and
agenda.
that's how it transpired.
Speaking of agenda, can we move it?
Yeah. Let's go. Okay. One last.
In response to the question about Doctors Without Borders, recently I was listening to public radio, a show on 3 o'clock called The World, which is very pro-Soros and all that, I would say. And indeed, Doctors Without Borders was engaged in what I would call a publicity stunt in Turkey, setting up in a quote-unquote safe house, a secret unit to give aid and comfort to those fighting against the Syrian government, and it was being played up to and hyped up on public radio.
Gotcha. Same game. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.